As someone who's played the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG for pretty much my entire life, one of the things that I immediately noticed when I picked up Duel Links competitively for the first time 9 months ago is that every single Duel Links meta deck, or at least the vast majority of them, never saw any play in the TCG. And when I say didn't see any play, I want to clarify what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about the fact that the meta decks in Duel Links not only weren't meta decks in the TCG, but also they weren't even really rogue decks. We're talking about decks that basically didn't see any competitive experimentation. Now, of course, whenever a deck comes out, and many of the Duel Links decks are actually really old cards, or really old strategies, whenever a deck comes out, people want to experiment with them a little bit, maybe for like the first week or the second week, but after that, most people just drop them unless they're really dedicated hardcore fans. And what I noticed about the Duel Links meta strategies is that people pretty much only played them as casual decks in the TCG. They weren't a blip on anyone's radar, even as a rogue deck, and that's pretty funny to me. Now, obviously, there are a lot of factors that sort of make this happen. The card pool differences are huge when you compare Duel Links to the TCG. You're looking at about like a fifth of the cards, or maybe even like less than that. I don't actually know how many cards are in Duel Links, but you're looking at a few thousand cards versus like the 10,000 cards in the TCG. Also, you have a different rule set. You have 4,000 life points. You have a smaller field. You don't really have that many extra deck summons. I mean, very recently we've gotten some really good synchro decks, but overall you don't see a lot of extra deck summoning, especially when I talk about these decks. And it's just really interesting to me how Konami can take these decks that were only casual strategies in the TCG and suddenly transition them, with obviously a lot of help, into these meta strategies in Duel Links. In today's video, I'm going to go over 5 casual TCG decks that didn't see any competitive play as a meta deck or a rogue deck, and talk about how they were meta in Duel Links. And also I'm going to talk about some of the reasons that they weren't good in the TCG, as well as briefly touch on the fact that many of these decks had cards that in Duel Links would have been broken, but even with those cards in the TCG, they still weren't more than a casual deck. When I first started playing Duel Links competitively, the top meta deck by far was Fur Hires. And what's funny about that is that the Fur Hire deck of Duel Links, the full power Fur Hire in that game, didn't even have the deck's best card, the Monster Negator with 2,800 attack points. That wasn't even in the game, and the deck was still dominating everywhere. And there are a few reasons, and I've talked about this in an entire video, so I won't spend too much time on this, but basically the Fur Hire deck is really bad, especially when they first came out in TCG, at actually putting extra deck monsters out there. They didn't have their Link monster yet, none of them are tuners, they're all different levels, but in Duel Links that didn't matter as much because no one was really summoning extra deck monsters when that deck was big. Obviously we eventually got synchro monsters, but even those took a while to become competitive. So what the Fur Hire deck did in Duel Links was just summon a lot of big monsters and set up one negation, just whiz, and that was enough. And it was doing the same thing in the TCG, but unfortunately for Fur Hire players, it wasn't enough compared to the other TCG decks out there. It is funny though, just thinking about how powerful Fur Hire were, even though they didn't have their best main boss monster. The main reason you play Fur Hire is the champion Fur Hire, and people just didn't have access to it in Duel Links, and yet it was still very powerful. The other deck that was very popular and was a pretty good counter to Fur Hires, and eventually became the top deck once Fur Hires took a couple hits, was Amazonas. And here's the deal, if you've seen my videos where I talk about Amazonas, I've done a few deck profiles with a more casual deck, you know that the deck has not only one, but multiple broken cards, or at least cards that would be broken in Duel Links. Things like Amazonas Village and Amazonas Call would be insane in Duel Links, but obviously when you look at the TCG deck versus the Duel Links deck, the Duel Links deck was able to be meta without many of those powerful cards that at least make the deck at least a little casually playable in the TCG. The reason it's able to do that is because Duel Links is a lot more battle focused than the TCG. There's not nearly as much monster destruction going on or backrow destruction going on, and that made Amazonas Onslaught extremely powerful. If you played that card in the TCG, which I personally have tried, it always just gets Twin Twisted or MST or Nightmare Phoenix, but when you played in Duel Links, the only good out, especially when the deck was meta, was something like Cosmic Cyclone and maybe occasionally Twister, but then you get the special summon effect, which in Duel Links is a lot more rare when you think of card effects. But just in general, the Amazonas deck, when you look at it in the TCG, it got many of these good cards like before they got them in Duel Links. The problem is that the deck just doesn't have enough attack power, it doesn't have a win condition. You once again see the issue that you see in Fur Hires, in the TCG version at least, where you have a lot of mismatching levels that don't actually end on any particularly good board. The Amazonas Adonis Princess into Onslaught opening is really scary in Duel Links, even now that those cards are semi-limited and limited, but in the TCG, basically no one cares about that kind of opening, and even if they did, they have infinite outs to deal with the one Onslaught. It doesn't really affect most TCG decks. And that brings us to my all-time favorite Duel Links deck, and that's Vampires, a deck that basically saw no play in the TCG, just like the other decks we've talked about in this video. That's surprising to players because just like Amazonas and just like Fur Hires, Vampires were extremely oppressive when they were a tier 1 strategy. They had everything that most of the other decks didn't have. Grace and Kingdom were some of the most easiest forms of spot removal in the entire game, and when you think of Duel Links format, not a lot of decks actually have that sort of level of removal. Vampire Grace, when you combine it with Kingdom, is basically just a 2000 attack monster that can blow up any card your opponent has. You don't find that in other Duel Links decks. Not to mention Vampire Vamp is an insane piece of removal when you can just steal an opponent's monster, and because there's less life points in that game, you can just attack them directly pretty much every single time with Vamp just for a quick OTK. And what Duel Links players might not know is two things. First off, the Vampire cards, many of the good ones, the best ones, when you're thinking of Domain and Retainer and Familiar, those cards were all released at the exact same time as Fur Hires in the TCG, and yet the third archetype of that pack doesn't really work in Duel Links. It's mainly a Link summoning deck, and that's the only competitive deck out of that pack. But also they might not know that Vampires in the TCG have an insane card, Vampire Domination. It's a counter trap, kind of like Solemn Scolding that you guys are probably familiar with, except you only have to control a vampire monster, and also you gain the life points if you destroy the monster card. Doesn't cost you anything. This card in Duel Links would probably break the game more so than Amazonas Princess, more so than even the Fur Hire boss monster. This would have been ridiculous in a Duel Links context. I'm so glad they didn't add this to the game. It would have been basically impossible to beat that deck if they would have had this card. It's also kind of funny that even the vampire decks that did exist at a casual level in the TCG didn't play a lot of the cards that you would see in Duel Links. You definitely didn't see Vampire Grace. You absolutely didn't see Samurai Skull. There's a whole nother zombie engine that's played in the TCG that you don't really see in Duel Links. Maybe you will eventually, probably not though, but the three best zombie monsters that you see played in a vampire deck, the three best off-theme monsters, Mizuki, Unizombie, and Shiranui Solitaire, all three of those cards don't exist in Duel Links, so a Duel Links vampire deck is going to look very different from a TCG vampire deck, or just for that matter, any zombie deck is going to look pretty different just because those three big cards don't exist in Duel Links. There are many differences between the Ancient Gear deck that Duel Links players know and the Ancient Gear deck that TCG players play casually, but I think the best card to point to truly blow the minds of Duel Links players that don't play the TCG is Ancient Gear Catapult. And when you read this card, you might be asking yourself, well, how is this deck not meta in the TCG, or how is this deck not even rogue? Because Ancient Gear Catapult in a Duel Links context is ridiculous, maybe even better than Vampire Domination, just because, oh my god, this would just kill you every single time. All you would have to open is Catapult and you basically win every single game. So without this card and without a lot of the Ancient Gear cards, way too many to mention in this video, Ancient Gear still managed to be a meta deck. And I think the biggest and easiest way to explain that is you just look at the deck and realize that it can't do 8,000 damage, it can only do like that 4,000 damage or 5,000 damage, and in the TCG that's just not good enough. Also, it's much more important than TCG to actually have a good first turn opening. When you think of Duel Links decks, a lot of the times, the ones especially like Ancient Gears that are more of an OTK based strategy, their entire first turn is just normal summon Wyvern pass, or special summon a Reactor Dragon, not really do anything else, but a 3,000 attack vanilla monster basically doesn't really do anything in the TCG format. Yes, there are some annoying Ancient Gear cards, yes, they can OTK you in the TCG, but it's a lot rarer and a lot easier to disrupt with plenty of other options that you have as removal and interruptions in the TCG versus Duel Links. And that brings us to the deck that was the least playable in the TCG format, because at least these other four had some experimentation casually, but the Yubel deck, the Fire King Yubel deck, basically didn't exist in the TCG. There are a few reasons for that. First off, you have to realize that the Fire King monsters and even the more recent Sacred Phoenix support monsters were released like 10 years after Yubel originally came out out back in 2007, I think it was, or 2008, one of those years. So basically when those cards came out, you had a slew of just way more powerful dark monsters. That was like Return Dark Arm Dragon, then eventually Teledad. The Yubel cards were basically irrelevant. They were actually like the big Yubel Ultimate Nightmare was the pack artwork for one of the best sets in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And yet those cards basically didn't see any play. You didn't really have a lot of good ways to destroy the Yubel without summoning it, and there were some bad ways that you could bring it out to the field. You could do things like send to the graveyard with Armageddonite or Foolish Burial and then call the Haunted back. There were a lot of really bad combos that didn't really make any competitive impact and weren't even really explored that much casually. And then eventually when we got the Fire King support, there's a whole bunch of other Fire King support that was much better than ever people thinking of playing Yubel. But also I think when you notice me playing against a deck, one of the reasons that I mean, I lose to it a lot when I'm playing Six Samurais, but at least with the older decks, it didn't really matter because a lot of times once they get that Ultimate Nightmare out, you can just push through it. It doesn't have any protection. All the Yubel cards have is battle protection, which, like I mentioned earlier, is really important in Duel Links. When you're thinking of the TCG, even back in 2007, 2008 time, battle protection basically was irrelevant. You needed to have more protection than that, or the card had to be easily summonable or actually make an impact on the board. So by 2013, when most of the Fire King cards came out, in 2016 when Fire King Island came out, people weren't really thinking of Yubel, and even by 2016, people weren't really thinking of a pure Fire King deck. They're just using Island and a variety of other strategies like Cosmos. So even if you would have put the Duel Links Yubel deck, like the one with all of the new support, like the Sacred Phoenix and the Fire King Island, if you put all of those cards back in a 2007, 2008 context, it very likely still would not have even been a rogue deck because, yeah, battle protection in the TCG just doesn't matter. A zero attack monster, even with all the extra support that would have come out like 10 years after, that stuff just doesn't matter even back in 2007. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video. I think I would like to do more of these discussions that sort of can appeal to both Duel Links players and TCG players. The two ideas that I had was basically the opposite of this video, so like the 5 good TCG decks that were terrible in Duel Links, and also doing these videos for individual cards as well, because there are some hilarious examples in both of those video ideas where decks that people in Duel Links would say are awful were really, really powerful in TCG, and also some of the best cards in Duel Links basically were just garbage in the TCG, like Wall of Disruption. Anyway though, if you want to see those videos, let me know in the comment section below, but I'll see you later. Goodbye.